Hello everyone, in this video tutorial we are going to see about automatic and manual watermarking in Mule 4. For automatic watermarking we are going to use the on-table row operation from the database module as a trigger, and for the manual watermarking we are going to use a scheduler as a trigger and the object store to keep track of data that has already been processed. So here what I'm doing is I'm generating some dummy data. So here in my SQL I'm creating watermarking database, and in that database I'm creating persons table. The persons table has this columns: person ID, last name, first name, address, CD, and state. And I'm going to just generate some random data and insert into my SQL. And what we are going to do is I'm going to continuously every 5 seconds insert data to my SQL, and the on table row operation should be checking if there is new data in the database, and if there is new data in the database it should export it to it should write it to CSV format. That is the automatic watermarking. And for the manual we are going to check if there is new data for a couple of status, for the New England status, and grab that data and insert it to Postgres. So automatic watermarking is relatively easier, but manual watermarking has more flexibility, as we are going to see. So here I have I have my SQL workbench. I created a database, and under that database I created this table. Now there is no any data there, as you can see. If I run this, just we have only the columns, no rows there. And I did the same thing in Postgres. So let's assume so from the US status we have all these status here, and let's say I'm interested to export data for New England status to Postgres, and the New England status are these are the New England status: Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont. So we are going to export data for New England status from MySQL to Postgres. And here I have some Python function that generates some random data. I'm showing what the data looks like. So this is SQL code to insert a record to MySQL, insert into the persons table, here specifying the columns, and here I have the values. The values are just random values, except the state Connecticut here. As you can see, the states are real status, and also the person ID will be sequentially increasing starting from 1. The rest of the values, first name, last name, address, CD, are just random characters generated from the letters, just generating 4 letters. So this one I'm going to let's write data to MySQL every 5 seconds rather than 15. So this one, it is going to be continuously writing data to MySQL. And if you want to try this, I will add a link to it. I will put it in my GitHub repo, and I will add a link to it in the description section, and you can play with it. So if I run this, it is going to insert data every 5 seconds to MySQL, and then using the automatic watermarking, we are going to monitor if there is new data in MySQL and export it to CSV. And in the manual one, as I said, in the manual watermarking, we are going to use a scheduler to see if there are new records for the New England status and export the data to Postgres. So this has more flexibility, as we can write whatever code we want. Like for example here, let's say we want to insert only all columns except the CD data. So we are going to see this. Okay, let's start with manual watermarking. So here what we are doing is there is data coming into MySQL, and from that we want to check if there is new data coming in for the New England status, and we want to filter the data and send it to Postgres. So I have a scheduler here, so it triggers every 5 seconds at fixed frequency, as you can see here. And we are using ObjectStore. So what we are doing is here we want to retrieve if we have saved the maximum ID that we have seen before. We want to save it in here, but if it is the first time, we want to give it a default value. So there's a default value for max ID is 0. This is for the first time. After that, once it processes, it sends data to Postgres from MySQL. It is going to save the max ID. It is going to save the max ID of the data that has been processed, so that records are not processed more than once. So in here, I have, this is just connecting to my local MySQL database, and from the persons table we can just choose a subset of the columns, and under this where clause we have where person ID is the ID column, which is this one, where person ID is greater than max ID here, and this colon max ID, this is the key, so its value we get it under, we get it from vars.maxid, and this max ID is what we retrieve here. If it is not there, its default is 0 for the first time, or else it will be value that is saved in the previous cycles when data was sent to Postgres. So here we get the data like this, and here I am creating a variable, simply the size of the payload, to log the number of records inserted to Postgres. Then here I here I have a choice router. So this choice router, what it is going to do is, if the payload is not empty, the upper row will be executed. But if the payload is empty, it will simply say no records were found, because the scheduler is going to be triggered every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, if it doesn't get data, it is going to print on the console no new records were found. Otherwise, it is going to send the data, insert the data to Postgres, and at the end it will tell us I have this last logger, this one, okay, yeah, it is going to log the payload, like the records that are inserted to Postgres. So I'm using for each, as you can see here, I'm using for each to insert to Postgres record by record, and I have the configuration for Postgres, and so this is insert command that we use. So insert into the New England table. So in Postgres we have created this New England table. Now it doesn't have any data. Insert into the New England table, we specify what the columns are, and the values are from these keys, and the values of these keys I specify them in this let me maximize this. So if you go down here, or maybe I can show the graphic view. Okay, so person ID, so you can see these keys are coming, their values are coming from the payload. Person ID is payload.person ID, last name is payload.last name, first name is payload.first name, and so on. So that is what we are doing to get the values of these keys. So under this, for each scope, each record is going to be inserted into Postgres. And that's a very important thing is from object store. So I'm using two operations from object store. One is retrieve, to retrieve the max ID that has been stored in object store, and another one is this one, to store the max ID. So if the size of the payload is not empty, if there is data, then it is going to calculate the max ID and store it in this variable called max ID. So the value of the max ID is simply the payload, the max maximum of person ID from the data that was previously seen, or from the data that has been processed already. So now I can send data at regular intervals. Let's say every 5 seconds we are going to send data to MySQL, and this flow should check every 5 seconds if there is new data in the database, in the MySQL database, for the New England status, or the New England states are again these ones. I'm generating data randomly every 5 seconds and inserting data just for all of the status just by every 5 seconds by picking randomly one of these status. It is going to insert data, and when there is data, when there are records for the New England status, it is going to process the data and send it to Postgres, and also save the max ID, the maximum ID of the data that has been processed. So I have deployed this application, so let me show you in MySQL Workbench. There should not be any data in this persons table. So if I run this, I don't have any data. And now I will go to this Python code and send data, just randomly generate data every 5 seconds and send it to MySQL. So if I run this code chunk, it is going to insert this data to MySQL. If I come here, I should see some 1 or 2 records. So as you can see, it has inserted 2 records. Both of them are for Louisiana. As you can see, the state column. And when there is a record, when there is data for New England status, for any of the New England status, then it should transfer the data to Postgres. So if I come here, it should tell me, because this trigger is every 5 seconds, it should tell me that it didn't get any records so far. So as you can see, no records found. You see no records found. Now let's go to Workbench and see if there is data for any of the New England status. So the New England status are again, yeah, we have Connecticut, for example. So it should tell us now in Endpoint Studio, it should tell us that it got 1 record. So if we come here, yeah, it says here, as you can see, message 1 record inserted into Postgres. Now if you go to Postgres, you should get 1 record. So if I run this, I should see 1, no. As you can see, there is 1 record. That record has been inserted. So now the max ID in this object store is it is saving the max ID for it is 11 in this case. Let's see if there are additional records. So Connecticut is here. So far we have only 1 record that from the New England status that has been inserted to my SQL database. And Vermont, yeah, here we see another state. So there is for Vermont. Now it should tell us again that it got another record. You see here, it tells us 1 record inserted into Postgres again, as you can see in this message. So another record has been inserted into Postgres database. Another one again here. This is a 3rd one. So if you go here, we can see it again. It is for Vermont, the same state. Vermont here, Vermont here. Now if we go to Postgres, we should see 3 records, at least 3 records so far. So if I run this, run 4, okay. So they are this one, and this one. Okay, so Vermont 2 times. Okay, where is the first one? Vermont, Connecticut. Wait, let's go see here. Which one are they? So they are Connecticut, Vermont, and Rhode Island. Yeah, so Rhode Island should be somewhere here. Yeah, it is here. Okay, so this is how we use how we can use manual watermarking. As you can see, it is more flexible. We use an object store to store the maximum ID of the data that has been processed, so that we don't process more than once. And then we can customize our code, and then in our next iteration, it is going to process only the data that newly arrived. So it will not process the data more than once. So here we store the max ID. In here, the max ID of the data, or from the payload, the max ID, we stored it here. So this operation, we put it under this choice router, we put it in the upper row, not like if we include this like here before going to the choice router, it will be a problem, because there are times where there is no new data, and if you calculate the max ID from an empty payload, it will be empty. So we need to calculate, we need to update this max ID only when there is data. So we want to put it in the upper row, and in here, this variable, I am saving the size of the payload, and I'm using that to just print in this transform message I have here. I'm printing a message, creating a payload that says the number of that tells the number of records that have been inserted to Postgres, and that payload is being simply populated here. So the payload here is not the record, but rather here the payload that I created here that tells us how many rows have been inserted to Postgres in that 5 seconds time window. So this is watermarking. Basically, the main things are storing the ID using ObjectStore, and in here the ID is simply calculating max of the person ID from all of the records. Just grab all the person IDs from the payload and give me the maximum value, and store it here, and retrieve that max value here. If there is no any max value, its default is 0. Then in this select operation, I want to get data from the database only for records that have person ID greater than max ID. So this is the manual watermarking. Next, let's see the automatic watermarking, which is much simpler and direct forward. So for the automatic watermarking, we are going to use the on table row operation from the database module to trigger a flow. And if there are new records in the database, we are going to export them to CSV and append the data to if there is data already exists, if there is file that already exists, append newly coming data to it. So the first thing we need is we go to the database module and bring this on table row operation, and we specify our configuration, database configuration. I'm connecting to a local MySQL database, and here is the table, person is table, and if I refresh this, I should see the columns it has. So the person ID, I want to use it as a watermark column because it is sequentially increasing. So let me make that an ID column also. So this one, every 5 seconds, I want it to check if there is new data in that database, and if there is new data, I want it to save the data to disk in CSV format, and append it to an existing file if there is a file that already exists. So, and by default, the data comes here from the database. It will come in Java format, and let's transform it to CSV format. So we use this transform message, transform message from the core operation core module, and change this CSV, and we want the payload. And the other thing is we don't want a header because we are appending data, so we don't want the header to be written again and again. So let's specify header is false. We don't want header. Okay, save it. So we have now the data in CSV format, and we want to write it to disk. So from the file module we have this write operation, so we can bring it here. Then here we specify the configuration. This is a local file connection, so I'm connecting to my working directory. This is simply my working directory. Here I have under tutorials watermarking data column, so data folder I mean. So under here I have this folder, so the data, if there is new data, the data from the MySQL database, you should export it and save it in CSV format here, and if there is new record also, you should append it to it. So if you come here, file path, let's specify the file path. We want it, I want it to write the payload, the data to this watermark.csv. Here we have already transformed it to CSV, and we don't need a header. And in here in the right, we want it to append it, so we go here, and the write mode rather than overwrite, let's make it append. Save this and run it. Now the project has deployed, as you can see. Now let's send data to the database. Again, I will run this Python code that inserts data to the database. I have deleted the records that I inserted before, so there are no any rows. Now I will start inserting data, sending data to MySQL every 5 seconds by running this Python code, and then we should see this flow. We should see every 5 seconds this on table row operation. Every 5 seconds it is going to grab new records from the database and append them to this watermark.csv file. So run this, is inserting. So now it has inserted this record, another record. So the person ID is sequentially increasing. That is why we are using it as a watermark column. So if we go to my SQL here, if I run this now, it should show non-zero number of records. As you can see, there are 5 records. And here, if you come to the console, okay, it's not logging anything. If I come here, oh yeah, it has created this watermark CSV file. Now I can open it. It has already written 8 records to it. As new records come, then it should append. Since it is every 5 seconds, it is going to append the newly coming data to here. So after some time, it will ask me if I want to reload it. So as you can see here, there were 8 records. Now it is asking me, do you want to reload because the file has been modified? Yes. As you can see, the number of records has increased. So what it is doing is basically this on table row operation from the database module is checking regularly every 5 seconds, keeping track of the person ID column to check if there are new records, and the new records, it gets them from the database and converts it to CSV and removes the header, and in here we are appending it to this watermark.csv. that data we are appending it. As you can see, we have the write mode here. Under the write mode we use it append rather than overwrite, so that is how it is appending it. Now if I reload this, we should have more number of rows because data is being continuously appended to it every 5 seconds. So as you can see, it has appended already. It has already written 26 records. And the reason we removed the header is, had there been a header, it would have been adding that also again and again. So in this tutorial, we saw how to use automatic watermarking. We saw how to use, let me stop this. We saw how to use automatic watermarking and also manual watermarking. In the automatic watermarking, what we did is, there is data that is being regularly inserted to MySQL, and we used the on table row operation to grab that data and write it to a CSV file. Whereas on the manual watermarking, so from the data that is being inserted to MySQL, we want to check if there is data for the New England status specified here, and filter the data and just to this status, and then write a subset of the columns to post